I'd like to open up by saying thank you for being here today and talking with us.
My pleasure.
And so where do you think we stand today with the trustworthiness of regulatory agencies like FDA and CDC?
So CDC isn't really a regulatory agency. You're focusing on domestic U.S. with that question rather than international. What we have observed, I think, is unequivocal, that the regulatory process, as I've been trained and has been practiced over decades and developed over decades with international standards, has been compromised during this outbreak. And what it's revealed is an underlying compromise that fits the phrase that many use to describe it, which is regulatory capture. But it's deeper than just regulatory capture. In the United States, we have a situation in which the pharmaceutical industry actively controls what's going on at both FDA and CDC, and apparently also at NIH. And that occurs through a variety of different mechanisms. Some of them are structural, and some of them are emergent phenomena of the nature of the industry and the relationship. The term that's used is revolving door. The relationship that exists between people that are employed by the government as regulators and the pharmaceutical industry. And we had a great example of that recently, where one of the senior members in the office of the director of the FDA, who works in the pandemic arm, so has direct responsibility for this particular outbreak, was caught on tape by James O'Keefe at Project Veritas, saying what we've all kind of known exists, but saying it very overtly and matter-of-factly, which is that regulatory officers are self-censoring because they are very aware that their, I don't know how else to say it, their marketability, their ability to earn a large income from the pharmaceutical industry once they retire from the FDA is a function of the decisions that they make while they're employed at the FDA. So there's an odd kind of forward-looking aspect to this self-censorship. And those of us that are here, I've dealt with DC and the FDA and the CDC now for decades in this vaccine space. And so I've been aware almost subconsciously of these relationships that exist. But what's happened with this outbreak is that it's really made everything kind of out in the open.
It's going to come to the surface?
Yeah. Things that have been long-standing compromises, aspects of these relationships between industry and government are increasingly overt and in many cases celebrated. The government has long used the term public-private partnership and has sought to develop those public-private partnerships.
So before it was a bit more understood.
Yeah, it was a little more under the covers. Wink, wink, nod, nod kind of situation. But now it's really open and transparent. On this topic, for me, in terms of my personal journey, I had traveled from the International COVID Summit in Rome down to Portugal to watch a horse show. But Portuguese intellectuals, thought leaders, politicians, legal people, media people, became aware that I was going down there because I had done a podcast with some people in Portugal, because Jill and I love Portugal. We breed a Portuguese horse, so we go back and forth. And they latched onto me as soon as I arrived and brought me into a meeting format that they had already established with about 50 key thought leaders in Lisbon. And we did two different media events, including a roundtable with an interview by a journalist, so kind of a town hall format in Portuguese, with a translator. That was fascinating. And a older woman whose members of her family had been vaccine damaged was sitting in the front row, and she asked a question in which, in asking the question, she prefaced it with a long statement about how she was speaking collectively for the group or for the Portuguese people. She said, "We'd always assumed that the US FDA and CDC were represented the gold standard for the world for regulatory review. And we have become aware now through this that those organizations are corrupt." And it was the first time that somebody had said that phrase to me, that basically that our American HHS had been previously seen as the gold standard to the world, and now it was clear to an international audience offshore in Portugal, European Union, that that organization was corrupt and could no longer be trusted. And it hit me like a brick to the head. It was one of those moments where it hadn't really formed in my mind a conscious awareness of this. And then since then, the information that we've seen come out, most recently as we sit here in early March of 2022, the New York Times piece that revealed that the CDC has been withholding data, and that the CDC is overtly now a political organization. And what that means is two things. Number one, the CDC has been engaging in, if I did it, what would be determined to be scientific fraud, and by withholding key epidemiologic data and basically formatting information for political purposes, public health information, and pushing it out for political purposes in their publications and in their press releases and in the statements from Michelle Walensky. And it also kind of took the covers off this situation that we have at the CDC, where they have a dual mission. Their mission is to promote the industry as well as to regulate it, to promote vaccines as well as to capture and catalog information about vaccine safety. And unfortunately, the primary emphasis seems to be on promotion and not on their core mission.
And do you think we can trust these agencies anymore?
Obviously not.
No. Over the last 2 years, what's the most questionable thing you've seen these agencies do over the last years? If you had to come up with one
single thing,
like what is
the one single event that I think is most egregious, and it's hard to sort because there's been so many of them, is the going back to the common technical document. This is the dossier that was submitted by Pfizer to justify proceeding with human testing, clinical testing, in which we learned that the regulatory agencies all over the world had failed to perform their job and ensure that fundamental aspects of regulatory oversight and characterization be performed before we initiated clinical trials. Now, beyond that, there's so many. The problem I have in answering your question is there's been so many specific examples of breaches of norms, egregious breaches of regulatory norms throughout the entire 2-year history leading up to this most recent one that I mentioned, which is that the CDC has been collecting data that it has not made available to physicians, scientists, and public health authorities because their rationale is they're concerned about vaccine hesitancy. And if you translate that, what they're saying is that if we made available the full scope of information that we have, people would not want to take vaccines. Well, that's basically a breach of fundamental medical ethics in terms of informed consent. And they're admitting to it. They have normalized it. And the press has normalized it. But there are many, many, many examples.
One technical question I had that I've had trouble answering is that they kind of telescope the 3 or 4 stages of trials to get these vaccines on the market. When people go and take these shots, are they engaging in a trial where they could be getting different dosages and placebos?
So I'm trying to answer your question from where I sit, because I have to focus on data.
Okay.
And one of the things I've been trained in as a legal expert, expert witness, is to never speculate about what's going on in somebody's mind. I don't know why or what they're doing. I don't know whether or not they, that by they we're talking about the axis of the FDA and the vaccine manufacturers acting in concordance, which is another breach that's happened. Okay, it's important to understand that under emergency use authorization, the FDA is functionally the sponsor, the regulatory sponsor. So they have a dual role. They are the ones that are sponsoring the product technically under emergency use authorization. And they are also the ones that are regulating the product. Which is contrary to any norm that's ever existed. Okay? And they've done this on a massive scale, obviously. So what we have is FDA asserting various positions and acting in concert, explicitly in concert with the pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturers, Pfizer and Moderna. And so how this relates to these regulatory dossiers and the various clinical trials, normally this is kind of an oppositional relationship between, which is effective.
And here they're the purchaser, the regulator, and the marketer,
and the sponsor technically. So this technical term sponsor in regulatory parlance, and that relates to regulatory law that's captured in the Code of Federal Regulations. So remember, the FDA, because it is overseeing interstate commerce, has the authority to that's where their authority flows to regulate the pharmaceutical industry, is from an interstate commerce point of view. And so they have federal law that guides what they do and how they do it. And they are serving in, as you point out, virtually all the major roles in this process. And as a consequence, the normal checks and balances, I think is the best way to put it, the normal checks and balances that exist between the pharmaceutical product sponsor, which is those who are responsible for the product legally, in terms of liability, etc., is the government. So I think that is one reason why, although FDA has provided this market authorization, is the technical term, you would call it licensure, this market authorization for these products, labeled as Comirnaty or Spikevax, is the product names they've used. Neither one of those products are being marketed in the United States. You cannot buy Comirnaty. You cannot buy a licensed vaccine, even though the FDA has licensed the vaccines. The companies will not sell them into the United States because they're able to get the benefits of a guaranteed market and a guaranteed purchaser, that being the US government, which is, as you know, because of the mandates, been enforcing the use of that product without the liability in any way, in any sense of the term.
So they authorize Comirnaty, but they're not going to market with it here because they have more protection by using the EU.
And there's, from a business standpoint, there's no reason why they would.
Yeah.
Because they already have a guaranteed purchaser and a guaranteed market, which is the U.S. government.
But could you explain in a sense that the public was misled to think they were getting the authorized one in the U.S.?
There's no question that the public was misled, not just the public, but the Department of Defense personnel, for example. That's particularly egregious because there's a law placed after the Gulf War fiasco, Gulf War syndrome. There was a law put in, federal law, that the Department of Defense is not allowed to dose warfighters and DoD personnel with an unlicensed product.
And they're violating that.
And so they are absolutely violating that, and they are trying to cover it up. So when warfighter personnel, DoD personnel, receive their vaccine from a DoD medical provider, that vaccine is automatically listed in the medical record of that person as being Comirnaty, but there is no Comirnaty. Okay.
Really?
Yeah. So there.
Is that fraud? Just like
it is
plain and
fraud.
simple fraud?
Okay. And those cases are proceeding. The problem is the courts take a long time, and they've basically given warfighters the mandate: you will either be vaccinated or you will be discharged. In a hybrid situation. As I recall, they lose a lot of their benefits.
Yeah.
It's not a full dishonorable discharge, but it's a discharge for non-compliant. It's kind of a hybrid one. And what they've done is the DoD doesn't want any of these cases to come to court, because if they come to court, then they'll be forced to go into discovery, and all this document trail will be put into the record, public record. And so what they've done is anytime any court case gets close, they will basically settle with the warfighter to keep it out of the courts. They'll offer the warfighter some sort of an out, but it's not basically full retirement of the full package that they would get otherwise if they had served honorable discharge.
They give them less than they would have gotten?
Precisely.
Okay.
But it's a clear tactic to avoid legal consequences of this shell game that they're performing, which is enabled by the FDA with this strategy of technically licensing a product, but then wink, wink, nod, nod.
Yeah.
The pharmaceutical company never actually markets that product. You know, Pfizer and Moderna, for some reason, don't call me up and say, oh, this is our clinical protocol that we're implementing. And
is that publicly available information?
no, it's not. The FDA is hiding all of that.
So they're hiding all the clinical trial data and how it's being done?
Yeah, so while the product is under emergency use authorization or is not yet licensed, and the EUA products are not yet licensed, then the regulatory agency provides basically confidentiality to the pharmaceutical industry. So when you submit your dossier, your common technical document, your initial IND document portfolio, that initiates a process where all of that communication is confidential between the sponsor and the agency, or between the pharmaceutical company and the agency. And that cannot be FOIA'd. That's why we're in the middle of this huge fight over trying to get the legal fight over trying to get the Pfizer documents released. You'll recall this, the 75 years, or is it 50 years, or is it going to be this summer? And we've had a document release drop 2 days ago.
So when you take the shot, you're just signing up to...
You have no control over what's going on and no transparency.
Uh-huh.
That was my original complaint about all of this, is that it was breaching fundamental ethics in terms of informed consent. But what I'm trying to answer your question about whether or not there may be variations in the nature of the product that is administered to different people in different geographies or whatever, because they tend to be deployed by lot geographically. And my answer, in short, is I don't know. It is possible. The data that is most consistent with that, because I'm data-based. I have to be in this environment, in knowing that I'm in a situation where a lot of the data is being withheld intentionally. The data consistent with that hypothesis is that which has been summarized in the various databases that track vaccine lot numbers to adverse events. So that's the how bad is my batch and those kinds of databases. So what's clear is that different batches of these genetic vaccines that have been deployed into the US population have surprisingly different adverse event profiles. Adverse event means death and sickness associated with the vaccine, as cataloged by VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System that's maintained by the CDC. So when you map those VAERS adverse events like death or myocarditis or the other things to vaccine lot, what you find is that some vaccine lots have a very high incidence of these adverse events, and some of them have almost none. So those data are consistent with the hypothesis that there is lot-to-lot variability. I think that's very clear.
And that could be.
And the question is it intentional, or is it a consequence of poor quality control?
But I mean, knowing
I think that making a statement that making the leap from we observe these lot-to-lot differences to concluding that there is intentional manipulation of these lots for purposes of clinical research is a leap, and I can't make it. That's an inference. That is not a conclusion. That's a hypothesis.
Yeah, so we got phenomenology. We could explain it in different ways.
Precisely. It could be as simple as they're just really sloppy in their lot release and quality control.
Either way, it's not good for...
No, there's no good explanation for this.
And isn't it like Alexander Henry Oncode pointed this out in an interview with me, that they skip the stage of approval where you make sure the production processes are consistent to get the same product?
So they didn't do lot consistency studies, which is de rigueur for any regulatory dossier.
So that's pretty alarming, huh?
One of, as you said, I said when you asked me the question, what's the most egregious thing here? It's really hard to say. I mean, it's a huge menu of transgressions, regulatory transgressions and clinical research norm transgressions. And the press attempts to make the case that this is not true, but the data are crystal clear to me as a specialist in this area that Operation Warp Speed resulted in compromising the norms in clinical research in many, many different ways. And for the average person, it's easy to tell that that's the case, because normally it takes over a decade to get a vaccine through the licensure process. And clearly it hasn't been a decade. So that alone demonstrates that corners were cut. The position of the government has been that no corners were cut, which is just demonstrably false.
And so knowing what you know, why did you take the vaccine?
I get this question all the time. Remember that I took the vaccine, which was Moderna, as soon as it was available in this little geographic area of rural Virginia. It was part of a campaign that was managed by the military. I had long COVID. Part of my origin story is that I was infected in the first wave in Boston with the Biogen outbreak. I happened to be at MIT at a computational drug discovery conference, and I was staying actually directly across from corporate headquarters of Biogen and walking to the conference on a daily basis. And I got infected during that first wave, which was apparently in retrospect, it was the virus that had passaged through Italy and become even more virulent than the original Wuhan strain. That's what hit Boston and New York. So I had developed long COVID. There was no drug treatments. That's how I discovered famotidine, actually. I was sitting in that bedroom treating myself with the drugs that we'd discovered using the computational tools. So I'd been incompletely treated early for COVID, and beginning at about day 6 or 7. And I developed significant long COVID symptoms. I couldn't walk up this hill without stopping for a rest. I had many symptoms, and this is late February, early March 2020. And so those long COVID symptoms persisted, and this is at a time when the government was still denying that long COVID was an issue. But there was a lot of rumor being circulated that if you took the vaccine, it would overcome the long COVID symptoms by giving your immune system a boost. And as a trained immunologist and virologist, I thought there was some logic to that. I could see how that might be the case. I also needed to travel. I knew that I had international travel coming up, and absolutely that's been true. I've been traveling all over the world, and certainly stateside almost consistently, and going to places like Puerto Rico and Hawaii that require vaccine passports, as well as Europe. So I knew this was likely to be the response of the international community, that to travel internationally and to some of these other areas, you were going to have documentation of vaccination. So for both of those reasons, I went ahead and took the vaccine. And it turns out that my second dose of Moderna, I had very significant adverse events, including hypertension with a systolic blood pressure up to 230. I'm lucky to be alive. But it turns out that when we tracked the batches that I received, my second dose of Moderna was from what's now known to be a bad batch, a batch associated with a high event rate for adverse reactions. So, and I remain on antihypertensive medication and medical management for the hypertension, and it's only partially resolved. Do I recommend vaccines? This has been a very difficult and evolving position for me, and I wish that the CDC would also recognize that this is a very dynamic question. The position that I put out together with Peter Navarro in the Washington Times has essentially been a modification of the Great Barrington Declaration position, which is that the vaccine should be reserved for high-risk groups and should not be universally deployed. And then we can argue about who the high-risk groups are, but that's down in the weeds.
Because I guess you have a long history in developing vaccines and
over 30 years.
Vaccines, and so I guess a lot of the people that follow you are skeptical of vaccines in general. So what is your position on vaccines in general?
So that also has, for me, been a journey over the last 2 years. And I'd always assumed that the core of pediatric vaccines were well justified. I had totally assimilated the official position of the vaccinology community, which is that these vaccines are responsible for the sharp decline in pediatric disease starting mid-century.
Like polio and
MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, etc. It's been brought to my attention through this that if you actually look at the epidemiology of these pediatric infectious diseases, if you're data-based, if you look at the data and the timelines, the sharp decline in incidence of these pediatric diseases in almost all cases, precedes the deployment of the vaccine, including polio. They seem to have had the decline in the pediatric infectious disease seems to be better accounted for by changing sanitation practices rather than by deployment of these really first generation vaccine products. So I'm now, if I was in a position of advising a new administration on issues relating to the Health and Human Services mission space, one of my recommendations would be that we need to set up a commission and do a fully independent assessment of the entire Vaccines for Children program. I don't know what the answer is at this point, and I don't want to prejudice that, but my position has absolutely evolved that the assumptions that I have been brought up with as a vaccinologist about the effectiveness of the pediatric vaccine schedule and the Vaccines for Children program, that now, at a minimum, needs to be revisited.
Yeah, because there's just so much homework to do on each product. It's like, and you're talking about dozens of products.
But the data are there. I mean, it can be done. This should be something that the government, this should be what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is doing.
And I guess what's your response to just looking at vaccines as a blanket? People are like, oh, they're all good or they're all bad. And
obviously that's not data-based to make a binary judgment. I think that's one of the logic flaws that a lot of people have fallen into, and I see it happening all the time, and I have to fight it myself, is to think of these kinds of things as either this or that. I think it's much more useful to think about these issues as a grayscale, as a spectrum, and that each of these products should be evaluated independently as a risk-benefit calculation evaluation for each cohort. That's in terms of the global what went wrong here. One of the things that's really clear is that the approach of evaluating vaccine effectiveness and vaccine safety in the case of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines and really all vaccines, evaluating them in which you treat the entire population as a single block, that's not good business practice. That's not good regulatory practice. That's not good public health practice. That's not what we should be doing. And what had been alarming to me from the outset, and I actually spoke to Nancy Pelosi's office about this directly in a long teleconference, Zoom conference, is that there absolutely our public health response would have been much more appropriate and focused had we performed risk-benefit analysis stratified by age and medical condition. And that's always been what we've done in the past. This is what the CDC group, the ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, has always done, is a risk-benefit analysis using the tools, basically, of the insurance industry, the actuary tables. We call this quality-adjusted life year calculations. And there's a formal risk-benefit process that is used by the insurance industry. It seems a little commercial, not very humanitarian, to put value on somebody's life and how many years of life they have. But that's what the insurance industry does because of the nature of their business. is they have to place value because they give payouts. And so they have to be able to document that value that they place on people in terms of cash has merit and justification. And so the whole system that they've built for doing that is very well developed, very well documented, and it has been being deployed at the CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. In the case of this outbreak, we've completely disregarded all of that past practice, and we've treated the entire population as one monomorphic block. And so that has led to many, many bad decisions, in my opinion, about this vaccine. And I think now, if I was in a position of influencing public policy, my recommendation is that we go back to this more rigorous, stratified way of evaluating the data, and we revisit the entire Vaccines for Children program and do a rigorous cost-benefit analysis for these interventions and subject it to public review.
But I'd also like to ask you about your tie. You always have this tie on in the interviews. Where'd you get it? Did you get the virus?
So Jill ordered it from Amazon originally. It was this particular tie. I originally, Ryan Cole was the first person in our group to buy it. You can find it on Amazon. People often ask, is it produced in China? There's no markings on it that these ties are produced in China. They appear to be a domestic U.S. product. I don't know about the fabric and the fabric printing, because it's not labeled as a product of the People's Republic in any way.
Made in Wuhan?
Nope, not made in Wuhan. Let's see, what does it say? It says 3Rooker, www.3-rooker.com. So it may be a domestic U.S. product. I don't know. It's sold through Amazon. And everybody loves these ties. They come in 3 different colors. And on Rogan, I had mentioned that I was going to need a bow tie, and that I really wanted to get one in this same material because I'm going to have to wear a tux for an event coming up. And we ordered another color of one of these from Amazon, and to our surprise, along with that came a freebie where they custom made a bow tie for me using the same material.
That's cool.
Another fun story about the tie. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to speak at the Senate Republican Caucus lunch. And so I did my thing and, took questions and spoke in the Senate. And then one of the senators brought me back up to his office and wanted to do a podcast. And he was almost like a child. He was so excited. He had to show me that he had ordered this tie and it had just arrived from Amazon. He showed me the package. So the tie.
What motivated you to speak out, to come out and speak publicly so much this last year?
Yeah, it's another kind of boiling frog issue. Jill Malone, PhD, my wife, and I have both been trained rigorously in clinical research and bioethics. And I have a long and deep experience in regulatory affairs and vaccines in general. And what I saw was the norms that I had been taught, the norms of my industry in terms of the bioethics, and not just the norms of my industry, but what's codified in federal law as the common rule, were being disregarded. And for somebody like me, what that meant was that everything that I'd been taught, the practices that had been central to my doing my business as a consultant and a subject matter expert, were being thrown away. And what I saw was a growing erosion of the norms in my entire industry. And that was alarming and threatening. and fundamentally not right. And so the motivation for speaking out is fundamentally doing the right thing and trying to save lives. Because what's been done, I could see back then, for instance, in the Dark Horse podcast, that as these norms were being disregarded, people's lives were being placed at risk. And as a physician, that's a tripwire. And you kind of have a choice at that point of going along with the system and the consensus, or doing the right thing ethically. And I've been trained so many times, so repeatedly, and it's kind of fundamentally in my culture to act in a way that is ethical and honest, with integrity. And when I saw what was going on, I faced a kind of a conundrum. I had learned over years that to operate in this Washington DC space, the best strategy is to keep your head down. The phrase that's often used is, if they can't see you, they can't shoot you. And so I'd long been below the radar intentionally. And I faced a decision of whether to speak out and say, no, this isn't right, or to continue to stay below the radar. And for me, ethically, and my wife and I, Jill Glaspelman, discussed this at length, we decided that there really wasn't an ethical position other than to raise our concerns and voice them in various media, including in the alternative media, the podcast, kind of like what we're doing now, and in our written publications.
This has been like kind of a full-time job for you this last year.
It's yeah, we didn't know what we were getting into, and it's kind of consumed us. The last time I rode a horse was when I was shooting this documentary that I mentioned in Spain for Headwind TV, that's about to come out. It is incredibly demanding. My travel schedule is nonstop.
Like this afternoon, you're taking a plane right after this?
Yeah, so I have to go down to the Glenn Beck show in Dallas. It just goes on and on and on. I was at CPAC last weekend. It's draining.
You think you'll keep it up, or?
Of course. I mean, this is where we are in, as you know, because you've been doing these series. This is a moment in history where the impact of our actions now is going to reverberate through time. And it kind of comes to a point that was well enunciated in a podcast that I did with Peter McCullough and Matthias Desmet, where Matthias rolled out the logic that, from his analysis of the psychology of totalitarianism, and the phrase that I used on Joe Rogan podcast that caused Google to lose its cookies was mass formation psychosis. But this is based on deep scholarly work of Hannah Arendt and many others over literally centuries. Matthias pointed out that the only thing standing between the culture and society and those that are experiencing this form of hypnosis that we call the mass formation is those dissenters who are speaking truth and fact-based information that's contrary to the narrative that those that are subject to this phenomena have fallen into, the hypnosis. And so we have if you think it through ethically, those of us that have been identified as leaders and have a voice nationally and globally as dissenters must continue to dissent, or the mass formation process will go deeper. And the only thing standing between that and the consequences of that, which are profound, including targeting various groups in other dysfunctional behaviors, the only thing standing between that is dissenters speaking alternative narratives, basically. And but it is a extremely difficult, tenuous position, because there's a long history of people that act as dissenters when these phenomena take place, being targeted.
So we could be considered terrorists for having
terrorists, or yeah. So what Matthias teaches is that we have to be extremely careful not to use violent language or to act in a violent manner, because that will trigger a very strong violent reaction that basically will be overwhelming and will be disproportionate. And I've been amazed at how accurate his predictions have been, and to the point that I'm making now about being so careful about potential violence is what happened in Canada with the trucker rally.
Yeah, they've stolen the trucks and auctioning them off,
and used the mounted police to do these flanking moves that resulted in people being stomped, all kinds of violent acts, and weaponizing the banking system. I mean, the reaction was clearly disproportionate to the stimulus, which is exactly what Matthias predicts.
So your PhD thesis kind of laid the groundwork for this mRNA vaccine?
So it was my PhD thesis. I took a master's in lieu of a PhD, and this was the work at UC San Diego, Salk Institute, Molecular Biology and Virology Laboratories, that happened basically between 1986 and 1989.
I guess you laid the groundwork for these mRNA vaccines, right?
There were 9 issued domestic U.S. patents that directly derived from that work, and then the subsequent discoveries I made at Vical. I wrote the original patent disclosures. I wrote and directly interacted with Ned Israelson in San Diego, who was the patent lawyer that wrote all those. I spent days interviewing with him.
Those are the basis of these products in the market?
Yeah, so those patents all issued, they were licensed to Merck. Merck decided to just use the DNA aspect of those patents, but they actively blocked anyone else, any other companies, from advancing either the DNA or the RNA aspects until the patents expired. So that was over a decade ago, and it was after those patents expired that the industry, other companies in the industry, started working on it. There was 2 major advances since what I did, and many small things, but one of those was the use of pseudouridine in the RNA. The pseudouridine is a chemical base, like, RNA is composed of A, U, G, and C. And so in place of the natural U, there's a synthetic uridine, pseudouridine, that is resistant to degradation and which confers basically an immunosuppression, a reduction in the inflammatory response to the complexes that are used to slip the RNA into cells. So that was one, and that's one. It turns out that isn't actually essential to use that technology. But that's been the basis of the claims that Carrico and Weissman are the inventors, as opposed to myself and the others that I worked with.
How do you feel seeing these this technology rolled out globally?
I feel that it was grossly premature. The technology was not ready for global deployment, absolutely.
And you're not getting any royalties, or?
No, of course not. The only royalty, the only compensation I ever received for those patents was one Susan B. Anthony dollar. This had to do with the terms of my employment at Vical and the fact that the Salk Institute, while it filed a patent on my work from when I was a graduate student there, on the same date that the Vical patents were filed, they decided to drop that patent arbitrarily without telling me or anybody else at a time when my mentor was a member of the scientific advisory board of Vical. So the consequence of all that is that I never got anything really for any of this, other than academic citations and a lot of grief from the likes of the Atlantic Monthly.
You wish you had?
Denying what my contributions had been. Do I wish that I hadn't? No, it's not. It's not when you're in the throes of something like that. There's no window of opportunity. At least I didn't have. Like Oppenheimer, remember, had the moment of self-awareness. I think he said, he made a quote about the god Vishnu, as I recall. I'm become death. He had a moment of self-awareness of his role in the Manhattan Project and the consequences when he saw the bomb, but not when you're in the middle of it. When you're in the flow of the discovery and the events and the science, it's hard to step back and have perspective. That perspective comes with age and wisdom and experience, and when you're 28, you don't have much of that.
And you feel like that now, like Oppenheimer's quote?
I still think the technology and the approach has a lot of merit and utility. I think that it has absolutely not been ready for prime time. I think that one of the big challenges in the vaccine space is the one that I have been focused on for the last third of my career, which is biodefense. And the biodefense problem set is profound. And we lack a good technical solution that will solve that problem. To illustrate, just in a very crude way, with the U.S. Department of Defense has programs, funding, and projects in play to develop vaccines for literally all of the weaponized pathogens up until the end of World War II. Okay, so tularemia and plague and everything else, anthrax. And if everything goes as planned, they will complete that vaccine development process for those products, for all of the bioweapons deployed up until the end of World War II. That will be complete by the year 2050, which is literally a century after those threats have manifested. And the technology for engineering, as we've seen, in my opinion, with the Wuhan lab, I fully believe that this is an engineered virus. And it was intentionally created by EcoHealth Alliance with U.S. funding. And that threat has accelerated to such an extent that there is no way that we can keep up with it. It's not just the engineered pathogen threat, it's the emerging infectious disease consequent to environmental disruption. That's what caused Ebola. That's what's driving Marburg, is things like disruption of ecosystems, jungles and things like that are disrupting species and causing them to come into contact with humans, and therefore leading to crossover events between infectious diseases that infect those wild living populations and human beings.
And do you think that's true? Because that's one narrative being pushed now, like, oh, climate change is now causing the
just climate changes, deforestation, and a lot of other things. It's absolutely, there's no question that environmental disruption is a major driver of infectious disease crossover events. So is intensive agriculture. The practices, for instance, in China of this intensive agricultural system that's very efficient, involving bird, poultry, and pig, and often fish, in a little closed loop ecosystem that's recycling. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of merit to that. It's very efficient in terms of producing protein for human consumption, but it leads to interspecies crossover events. That is unequivocal. So absolutely, I don't want to. The global warming, global warming in particular, is enabling broader distribution of mosquito species, for example. So you have insect vectors that now have new habitats and new prey. Remember, really, from this point of view, you and I are the prey, and the virus is the pathogen. We are its food, and so these disruption events are absolutely leading to increased risk of interspecies crossovers between pathogens, which is, as a virologist, these crossover events are the high risk events. Okay. And they're going to continue happening.
Are you currently a shareholder or consulting on any COVID-19 vaccines?
No. I was involved with a traditional vaccine that was being developed by a large company in India, but I'm no longer involved in that project. That vaccine, I think, is about to enter phase 1 clinical trials.
In India or where?
Yeah, in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
And India is the primary kind of production locale in vaccines these days, isn't it?
So increasingly that's the case. And that feeds back to this point about the world becoming aware of the U.S. Health and Human Services system having been corrupted by pharma. One of the consequences of this playing out the way it has over the last 2 years is it's compromised the integrity and perceived integrity of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. India and China are hungry to pick up the pharmaceutical industry, and they are very actively pursuing that as a major economic growth opportunity. So we through our actions, whether presumably inadvertently, we have compromised a major industrial sector in the United States and set it up for our economic adversaries, whether or not they're political adversaries in terms of economic competition, there's no question, to take over that sector, both India and China.
So do you think we should have ever had lockdowns, testing, and tracking tracing for COVID-19?
So that's a complex space. The lockdowns, there are multiple comprehensive studies that demonstrated both in U.S. and throughout the world that there were more lives lost due to the lockdowns than were potentially saved by performing that. So it was not only economically damaging, but it damaged both psychological and physical health of people throughout the world in a way that absolutely does not justify those policies. They were a major public health mistake. Full stop.
And the tracking and tracing?
Tracking and tracing is a fundamental fundamental tool in public health. And when used properly in an environment in which a virus is starting to penetrate into a population, particularly a virus that isn't very infectious, it can be invaluable.
Like an Ebola type, where it's high death rate.
Ebola is one example, but Ebola is so overt and so fast that tracking and tracing.
You don't need it.
Yeah, tracing. I guess tracing is useful. So, one of the things that is overlooked with the West African Ebola outbreak, in which the vaccine that I worked on, the Public Health Agency Canada vaccine, and then I got licensed to Merck, and that became the licensed vaccine. Many people think that it was the Merck vaccine that stopped that outbreak. It wasn't. Experienced public health folks in this space all know that again and again, it is rarely, if ever, that the control of these outbreaks is predominantly consequent to a vaccine. It's almost always due to behavioral modification, public health measures, kind of classical public health measures, whether it's improvements in water sanitation, classically, or in the case of Ebola, what was really driving that outbreak was a cultural practice in West Africa of a prolonged mourning period where the person that has passed would be left in state and their family and friends would come and mourn them. And that mourning process, post-mortem mourning process, involves touching and kissing the cadaver. I'm using pathology speak. And Ebola and Marburg persist for long periods of time as infectious virus on the surface, the skin of people that have been infected. And so this cultural behavior of laying in state and having a mourning process where people are interacting with the corpse is what drove that outbreak. And once people were taught not to do that, that is really what quenched the outbreak. So almost always it's behavior modification that results in quenching, but it's important to understand, for instance, with Omicron, and I spoke about this before Christmas time, Omicron is so infectious. What we've had is partially been predicted by Geert Van den Bossche. Through the vaccination campaign, the universal vaccination campaign, and the natural history of viruses, what we have forced is an evolution of this virus to become more highly infectious. So we talk about this core baseline replication coefficient, R naught, and R naught is an expression of how efficiently a virus transmits between people in a given context. So R naught for this rural county is different from New York City.
Yeah.
But the R naught in general started off at about 2. And then with Delta, it was up to about 5 or 6. And now it's kind of in the 8 to 10 range. 8 to 10 is measles. That is insanely infectious. And what it means is that we knew back then, before Christmas, that no matter what the government did, this was going to sweep through the population and virtually everybody was going to get infected, which is exactly what happened.
Do you think vaccinations are an appropriate approach to COVID-19?
So I've said this repeatedly. The vaccine, my position has been with the Great Barrington Declaration that the vaccine should have been reserved for the high-risk individuals. They should not have been universally deployed. I am aligned with Geert Van den Bossche that this public policy was naive, ill-informed, and has probably driven the development of variants.
And you've worked with him in other companies before, right?
Geert and I both were employed at Solvay, so this is my large pharmaceutical background, and we worked in the influenza and other vaccine space, but in that time, when I was working for Solvay USA, I was working on a $300 million contract with BARDA to develop a cell-based influenza vaccine. So that's the context of Geert and I interacting.
And then you've co-authored or contributed to the Kennedy book on Fauci, and so there's a big section on there, HIV and AIDS, and so what is your opinion on the whole HIV/AIDS debate? And
the LAV-HTLV3 HIV story is part of my origin story as a young scientist at UC Davis in 1983 and 84.
So do you think HIV causes AIDS? Or
I was absolutely convinced that HIV causes AIDS until I read that book. I was very aware in real time about the Peter Duesberg story and about the controversy about that. But it had kind of, by that point, it had slipped off of my focus. I was then in graduate school. In retrospect, one of the problems that my colleagues at UC Davis have faced now for decades is that they were never able to reproduce the symptoms of AIDS with various versions of the simian analog. And they had tried to resort to what is basically gain-of-function research in order to try to create a virus that would cause the symptoms of AIDS, and they've never succeeded. I recalled in first person when, Davis being right next to San Francisco, and we had a lot of interactions. Don Francis, I considered a hero and was a colleague, friend. And the band played on, Don Francis from the CDC. So I recall very clearly the storyline of human herpes virus 8 and its potential role. And then I had some interactions with the Gallo lab when I was at University of Maryland, Baltimore.
So do you care to comment on his character? Or?
Bob Gallo is a piece of work, but he is cut from the same cloth that Tony Fauci is.
They're very close, aren't they?
I think Bobby overstates how close they were. They're more like frenemies. They're competitors in the same space. And Tony, Bob is, I have detailed knowledge of Bob because Flossie Wongstall, her husband, Flossie being one of his chief postdocs, and the mother of his illegitimate child. Stephen Stahl, her husband then, his father immigrated with my father-in-law. So we had detailed understanding of that whole story as it played out. Bob, in many ways, exemplifies a cohort of high-profile academic scientists in the United States that have come to dominate the funding and the politics of big science. And I think people focusing just on Dr. Gallo or just on Dr. Fauci misses the bigger picture. We've, over time, it's well documented, we've had a progression of power and money moving to very aggressive scientist academics that have acted almost as akin to small mafias in how they've been doing their business.
So if there was a push to, let's say, throw Fauci in jail, it wouldn't solve the issue.
No, the culture is deeply embedded in modern academia now. If the past is any predictor of the future in outbreaks, what we'll see is the government declaring victory, congratulating each other, and acting as if nothing ever happened and moving on.
Right.
Is there a need for, or will there be a political logic for throwing somebody under the bus like Tony? And it would have to also be Francis Collins, who has his fingers all over this also. I think it's reasonably likely that a case can be developed, and Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book on the real Anthony Fauci is basically a legal indictment. Politically, is it likely that happens? It's about as likely as people being held accountable for the waterboarding and torture. I just can't see that happening in DC culture. Mm-hmm. He is the J. Edgar Hoover of our generation.
Right.
And the question is whether Reiner Fulmich's case in Europe will proceed. And is Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins likely to find their latter years constrained by not being able to travel to some countries? I think that's highly possible. But if you're asking me to look into the crystal ball and predict what's going to happen in the DC kabuki world, is Tony going to be held accountable? No, Tony's going to get a medal and be retired, and a pat on the back, and nobody's going to want to go after him because if you put him under discovery and testimony, sworn testimony, the threads of damage that will be triggered by that will reach through both parties and all across America, and will compromise not just the entire health and human services system that we've built, but also academic medicine. And there's just too many forces in opposition to allowing that to happen. And yet, if it doesn't happen, we're just going to have the same dynamic develop again and again.
Did you ever work on any HIV vaccines?
Absolutely. My first contract was with Department of the Navy in 1991. For me, it was a big deal. It was over $1 million, which in 1991 was pretty big money. And it was for development of a DNA vaccine for AIDS, and it went nowhere.
And because there's a lot of overlap with the AIDS saga and the COVID saga in many ways.
It's a small community. Vaccinology is a small community, and that was one of the conscious decisions I had to make. Was I going to compromise my ability to operate within that community? One of the key decisions I faced was the consequences of damaging my ability to operate in that small community versus the moral obligation to speak out about what I was observing.
And have you had consequences to speaking out?
I've had particularly blowback from some folks that I've known since they were postdocs that are now very senior people in the Department of Defense. Obviously, I've been slandered and had my reputation intentionally damaged by various media outlets in a coordinated fashion. We've engaged a lawyer because there's clearly defamatory statements that were made by the Washington Post. That was a great example of advocacy journalism. That piece, a very young, recently minted journalist, so come through the modern journalism training, and he approached me well in advance and wanted to tail me all the way through. And I've had enough experience now with the media that the first thing we do is due diligence on the person that is approaching us, because one of the strategies we've learned over time is that the media person will act like they're your friend. They'll really suck up to you and compliment you, flatter you, talk about how they just want to tell your story. They'll say all these things that they know you want to hear. It's very much the same way that the CIA approaches these types of things. And so they'll tell the storyline of how, oh, we just want to get your story out, etc., and won't you talk to us and let us in and talk to us about all the detail, and then they take whatever they learn and weaponize against you. And so this is advocacy journalism. That's how the game is played. And for instance, Joe Rogan didn't get it. And when he started to get hammered, he apologized, which you can't do, and you can't engage with these people. So in that case, we did our diligence on this young reporter, saw that he was another one of these attack journalists. That's what he specializes in, is this kind of gotcha journalism. And we said no. And so he desperately sought to get in with people that like first degree contacts of us. The only person that he was able to get a comment from was Bobby Kennedy. But we realized the threat that he represented, and that he was not going to be a fair and balanced reporter, but rather was going to put together an attack piece. And that's exactly what happened. Over time, you get to where you develop a sixth sense. When I was at CPAC, we were in the speaker's ready room, the green room, and a journalist from the New Yorker was in there. And he had just interviewed one of the other speakers. And he came up to me and asked if I wanted to do an interview. And I said, I'm sorry, you're with the New Yorker. Thank you, but no thank you. He was very disappointed, and he got a wry grin. I mean, I knew from his facial expressions that he was looking to put together an attack piece. And I spoke to the guy that he just interviewed, and I said, you do understand what just happened? And he said, oh no, what have I done? But that's the way the game is played now, is this kind of gotcha journalism.
I've experienced that too. They reach out, they're real friendly, they're praiseworthy, and then they just twist it. So I mean, what's the best way to respond to them? Just not to...
No, you can't engage with them at all.
Just not engage.
Just say no. There is no win. There is no way anything you say will just legitimize their article. You cannot win. You just have to say no.
Yeah.
And that's what Joe and Spotify completely blew it. One of the amazing things of this journey for me has been working with media professionals and getting their advice and counsel. And media professionals that I engage with were shocked at how poorly that situation with Joe Rogan was managed.
So when you're faced with the setup, the solution is to walk away, huh?
You have to walk away.
Yeah.
Just do not engage.
And so you've worked with DITRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and other defense agencies?
Yes.
And do you have any active contracts or grants with them?
I still consult a little bit on a contract with a major defense contractor and government contractor called Leidos on the clinical trials for the drug combination that I helped discover of famotidine and celecoxib. So this is otherwise known as Celebrex and Pepcid, as a treatment, early treatment for COVID.
And do they have issues with you speaking out now, or?
There are some thin, bright lines. So I also sit on the active committee, which is run by the Foundation for NIH, that's running a lot of these drug repurposing trials and new drug trials for the government. The Foundation for NIH is literally a public-private partnership organization. We'll learn more about that soon when the Epoch Times drops their article coming out. But the active group really prefers that I don't speak about them at all. And they have reminded me that those meetings are confidential. One of the senior people at DITRA that I mentioned that I've known since he was a postdoc has actively, he appears to be the one providing some of the key quotes to the likes of the Washington Post. You'll see in their quotes, in the similar quotes have been in prior attack pieces. So and I speak about him a bit in the Bobby Kennedy book and his role in this. He did call me a few months ago and directly tell me to not talk about Michael Callahan, that the official position of the government was that we had no agents or personnel in Wuhan in the fourth quarter of 2019, and that Michael had lied to me, and I should stop saying this. So there was that, which is a pretty clear indication that I know Michael was there. He called me on January 4th. So that's clearly my speaking out had reached into higher levels. And this Government Services 15 individual, GS-15, is essentially a brigadier general rank.
But are there elements of the defense apparatus that are angry about what's going on with COVID-19?
Hard for me to say that. I certainly, for instance, Captain Tomlinson is a JAG in Pearl Harbor that I provided a sworn testimony for. She's a captain rank. She's mad as hell, and she's actively prosecuting a variety of cases having to do with the illicit actions of the Department of Defense in forcing warfighters to get these vaccines. I'm contacted from time to time by military personnel of various ranks, seeking assistance and expressing support. My whole career has largely revolved around supporting the Department of Defense. That's partially been by choice. DoD is much more focused on getting products made rather than academic papers published. So they're a better cultural fit for me. So I have a long history of supporting warfighter-related missions, and I think this is recognized by many. My sense is there's a lot of tension within the contractor corps and within the government at various levels about what's been done here, and but clearly most of those personnel are too afraid to speak publicly.
Yeah, but I guess are you speaking out? Is that in any kind of official capacity, or?
No, I can't speak in any official capacity. Of course not. Yeah.
And then where do you think we go from here with all this? I mean, what message of hope or a lot of people are feeling kind of hopeless with the sort of gravitas
helpless,
of it.
that's an interesting statement. You're using some key words. Helpless and hopeless are part of the diagnostic criteria for depression. And I try really hard to end interviews and speaking engagements on a positive note. You'll hear in many of my speeches and public engagements the words, I speak about the importance of integrity, dignity, and community. And those three words are, I think, essential to getting out of this. Our public health and really our entire government has destroyed or damaged integrity. And certainly the pharmaceutical industry has demonstrated a widespread loss of integrity. Dignity comes from a series of conversations I had with influential people in the Catholic Church who stress that one of the core roles of the church should be to protect human dignity and respect human dignity. And I think that, for instance, if you boil it down, the failure to ensure appropriate informed consent is in its essence a disregard of human dignity, the dignity of respecting individuals' personal rights. And community comes from my time with Matthias Desmet and the mass formation thesis, which is grounded in the hypothesis that the antecedent event that allowed all of this crazy to develop was the fragmentation of all of us from community, our social isolation through the various things, the lockdowns, the masking, and the preceding events that had happened where we were all turned against each other, and the media was weaponized against us, and social media actively manipulated our psychological state and isolated us and fragmented us into different communities. The loss of community is central to the mass formation process. And in support of that hypothesis is the observation I've made all over the world, and many others also. The people that seem to be most resistant to this mass formation process are the communities of faith. And they're the ones that have had strong, persistent community bonds. Many of these communities of faith have maintained sanity and integrity and have become centers of resistance, despite the fact that, for instance, the Pope in Rome is so tightly aligned with Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, which is one of the things that is just tearing the Vatican apart right now, and tearing the Catholic Church apart, is this tension.
Yeah, I interviewed Schneider and Vigano.
Oh, you interviewed Vigano?
Remotely,
really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Congratulations.
It's an interesting interview.
Don't disclose where you interviewed him.
Do you think there's any fertility issues being experienced from these vaccines?
So you ask a broad question. Are there fertility issues associated with the vaccines? And I have to stay carefully grounded in the data because this is such a sensitive topic. Mm-hmm. Ovaries controlled menstruation in women. There have been widespread reports and detailed information in the Orthodox Jewish community, for example. Rabbis know in detail about the menstrual history of the women within their congregations. We don't need to go into why, but they do. They keep track of this. And we've had this enormous number of reports from women, both reproductive age women who've had alterations in their menstrual cycle in various ways, reports of young children, female children, passing blood clots, reports of postmenopausal women that have started menstruating, which is usually a sign of an ovarian cancer historically, or a uterine cancer. So this was denied by the CDC for quite a long time. And surprisingly, the logic, actually the language of female hysteria was rolled out as justification, and which of course was infuriating to women. It was so mid-century, but now even the CDC concurs that these events are occurring.
Is that normal? And
no,
like
it's not.
Flu vaccination?
It's absolutely not normal. And so my point, you asked the question about fertility. We have alterations in menstruation, which is directly will have an impact on fertility, which is part of why the Orthodox Jewish community in New York issued an edict from the rabbis that young people shall not take these vaccines, and in general, even in adults, they're recommended not to take them because of the fertility issues. Pardon?
Would you caution women that want to have children?
I've cautioned it repeatedly. There is no reason for a healthy young woman to take these vaccines. On top of the menstrual irregularities, we have these, it's still anecdotal, but an odd rise in age of onset and aggressiveness of uterine cancers. we have the original observation in the Pfizer data package that the cationic lipid component, the synthetic fats that allow the RNA to slip into cells, accumulate in ovaries. And so this is why I've cautioned, remember my focus is predominantly on the children and has been since the outset. And this is why I've cautioned parents that there is a risk that these vaccines will impact on the reproductive health of their children. It's important to remember that girls are born, female children are born, with all of the eggs they'll ever have in their ovaries. You don't develop new eggs. They are just gradually produced and mature over time. And so things which damage ovarian tissue and ovarian function can have profound, long-lasting consequences, even if they're administered to a child before onset of menstruation and reproductive maturity. Is this going to turn out to be a major long-term public health catastrophe? I hope not. Is it possible? Absolutely. Long-term consequences of these vaccines and this technology remain unknown.
And then what is the best possible outcome and the worst anything going forward, or where do we go from here?
There's that, you can cut that where do we go from here question in a number of different levels. There's the deep damage that's been done to the entire medical system, hospital system, academic medical system, and the government's arm for health, which is the Health and Human Services. And there are think tanks and groups actively considering how to recover from this damage. And the damage, I believe, is profound, and it will be long-lasting. All over the world, and I encounter a subpopulation. People that come to my talks and rallies are a subset of the overall population, but people have really lost faith in the healthcare system, particularly in the hospitals, and I think that's pretty widespread.
And do you think we've seen like conflation of terms, of symptoms, of they're saying symptoms, conflating vaccine injury effects with COVID symptomology?
There's no question. And in fact, it's not, use the term conflating. There's a paper that examines the post-vaccination syndrome symptom profile and that of the post-COVID symptom profile. They cannot be distinguished. There is a statistically complete overlap. And it's not surprising because what they have in common is the spike protein.
So you don't think it's an intentional way to obscure the vaccine injuries?
You're asking about data manipulation on the part of the public health agencies. And the push to rationalize the surge in morbidity and mortality observed after implementation of the vaccine mandates, which is clearly identified in the insurance industry by the actuaries. And there are one attempt to rationalize this has been that with the surge of Delta, which corresponded with the onset of the vaccine mandates, somewhat overlaps, that much of that increased morbidity and mortality is attributed to the increased pathology of Delta. This is going to become clear over the next quarter or two, because now we have the Omicron wave. And so we'll get to the bottom of this. And the people, it looks like, that are going to be the ones that get to the bottom of this are the people in the insurance industry, not in stock market analysts, in those kinds of folks that have less, they have to be objective and rigorous. They don't have the luxury of spinning the data for political purposes, unlike CDC. So is there conflating and there's absolute overlap. I'm sure that there is some component of overlap between the morbidity and mortality associated with the vaccines and that associated with Delta. It's going to make it very hard to tease that out in the Q3, Q4 2021 data. This is why the Department of Defense surveillance system, epidemiologic surveillance system data is so important. Is in the United States, it's our most comprehensive data set that has best tracking because of the constraints of HIPAA, et cetera. However, these data are becoming clear, more and more clear in Israel, despite the fact that Israel has this contract relationship with Pfizer that constrains its ability to disclose information. It's absolutely, these signals have become more clear in the Scandinavian countries, who have an excellent public health system that tracks individuals much more thoroughly. The data are present in the yellow card system in Great Britain, but there's political aspects to revealing all of that data, the nature of those data, but it is going to come out. Do I know what the answer is right now? To say that would be, it would be propaganda for me to say, oh, it's going to be this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah.
I think we have to wait for the data, but I am concerned that there will be long-term public health consequences that will be non-trivial associated with the mandated genetic vaccines in expressing spike protein.
Okay, and the last final question real quick is, who's behind all this, do you think? The whole COVID saga?
So my current belief system, which has evolved over time, is that I cannot say that, I cannot distinguish whether the release of the virus was intentional or unintentional. I believe the data are quite strong that the virus, the original strain, was engineered, and that it was engineered in the Wuhan lab, and that engineering occurred with US financing, among others. I think that document trail is pretty clear. There's the whole thread of Event 201, which remarkably coincides with it appears that the original release was something in the range of September of 2019, and the original event in Wuhan. And there's this remarkable coincidence between Event 201 held at Hopkins and the onset of this virus and the threat scenario deployed at Event 201. There's clear evidence that there were investments and business decisions made in advance of the release of this virus by the NIH, by Moderna, by EcoHealth Alliance, by many of these commercial stakeholders that are difficult to account for without reaching to some sort of a conspiracy theory that they had foreshadowing or foreknowledge. The contrapositive to that is that it was clear in the literature and in my community that people recognized that these sarbecoviruses, the bat coronaviruses, basically, represented a major public health threat. We knew that from SARS-1. So it's hard to sort out, between the conspiracy theorists and just people doing good science that were foreshadowing what they thought was a high probability event. And a lot of people that are prone to conspiracy theories see those signals as evidence confirming their belief system. But the scientific community that I live in has long known that these bat coronaviruses, as a broad category, represented a major public health threat. And many people were trying to sound the alarm and get funding and do research to mitigate that threat. And we're doing so well in advance of this outbreak. So That has to do with the beginning of the whole thing. Once it had caught its hooks into everybody, there's the odd behavior of the People's Republic of China in not locking down until after the Chinese New Year, which is a major diaspora event in 2020. They were traveling to the United States. They were traveling all over China from Wuhan, and it was totally unconstrained. That's hard to understand why that was allowed to happen. And maybe it's just Central Communist Party politics and denial by bureaucrats trying to avoid responsibility for it. Maybe there's a simple explanation. Then we get into the stage where we see evidence of active psychological operations and manipulation by the UK government, by the US government, by many Western governments, and by the Central Communist Party of China and the World Health Foundation, World Health Organization. And I think in my mind, I think the most likely is along the scenario of don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that there was awareness of the opportunity that would present itself should a major public health crisis manifest, and then the operationalization of some of those plans in a kind of an opportunistic fashion. I'm not in with the this is all Klaus Schwab's grand scheme from soup to nuts. I haven't seen evidence to allow me to conclude that this was totally pre-planned, but in my mind, it is very difficult to reconcile the behavior of these leaders that have been inserted into Western democracies after completing World Economic Forum training as young leaders. And the fact that those, to my eye, maybe there's sampling bias, to my eye, the leaders that have been most harsh, most authoritarian, most totalitarian in their responses during this have the common thread of all having been trained by the World Economic Forum Young Leaders Program. And we have the various public messaging and pronouncements from WEF about RNA vaccines as basically a pilot program or an initial entree into the world of transhumanism, which they actively support. So my position is kind of a hybrid one. I'm not bought in that this was a grand scheme by Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab to take over the world in cooperation with the People's Republic of China from the outset. I do see it's hard for me to account for the behaviors, the messaging, the actions of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Secretary of Health for Australia, Justin Trudeau and his finance minister, many of the European leaders that have close ties to the World Economic Forum, Governor Inslee and Governor Newsom on the West Coast, both of whom are WEF trained, and their very strident positions. I know for a fact with Newsom, his wife is functionally anti-vaccine. And I've heard from third parties that he made these statements about mandatory vaccine policy in the state of California under some partial duress or pressure from an outside force, unclear what that represents. So my position is kind of a hybrid one. It's hard for me to reconcile the behaviors, the information, the data, the public pronouncements through this pandemic that seem to have the common ties for the most strident ones being a background in training in the World Economic Forum. with the various WEF policy positions that talk about these words, Great Reset. This is Klaus Schwab's book, this language. Build Back Better. This is more World Economic Forum language that has become part of the American political landscape and in the landscape of almost all of these other Western states. So that's where I stand right now. Is there does appear to be a coordinated political agenda, and then on top of that we have the clear coordinated media campaigns and messaging, and their alignment with the technology giants, Twitter, Facebook, etc., Google, YouTube, Microsoft, and big media through the Trusted News Initiative, and the corporate interests of these incredibly lucrative pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturing companies like Pfizer. All of these seem to be aligned, coordinated, harmonized, and the best way I can explain that is the hypothesis that what we're observing is the consequences of all of these corporate organizations functioning as subsidiaries of the large financial investment groups that own significant fractions of their preferred stock. So I believe there's clear evidence of corporatism playing a major role in this, and of the creation of public-private partnerships which have been advancing these various agendas. And I'm aware of additional information that's about to come out, but reminded that Mussolini himself is credited, the inventor of fascism, is credited, whether true or not, with the opinion that fascism would be better called corporatism, that fascism is fundamentally the fusion of the interests of corporations with the interests of the state. And that is what public-private partnerships are. And that is the position that's been advanced by the World Economic Forum. And that is absolutely what we have seen, in my opinion, is the fusion of the interests of large government with large corporations. In closing, I think that fortunately, Omicron is behaving as I had hoped it might before Christmas, and as even Mr. Gates is now acknowledging in his famous interview where he says that sadly Omicron has acted like an infectious vaccine and has spread through the population and is bringing the outbreak to a close. I hope that that's going to be the case, that we're not going to have additional escape mutants develop, and that it won't go down, the virus won't go down the path that Gert von den Bosch has been so worried about, which is simultaneous increase in infectiveness as well as increase in disease capacity, pathogenicity. It looks like we're moving out of this, and in my opinion, and now we face the long road of recovery, and I don't mean just financial, culturally. My closing is again to remember those three words: integrity, dignity, and community, and try to focus on rebuilding each of those. But overall, many people have used the phrase the Great Awakening as the contrapositive to the Great Reset. And there are large financial interests that wish to restructure the global economy around digital IDs and digital currency, and social credit type logic. I believe that our best weapon for all of us is to be informed, seek information from multiple sources, and think for yourself. It's often difficult to think for yourself and to figure out what to do in times like these, but it's absolutely necessary, and it's our best defense, is a populace that is committed not to listening to what I say and following my lead. I don't seek that. I really object to the development of a cult of personality. I believe that what we all need to do is take ownership for our own decisions, our own children, our own actions, and take ownership of seeking information from alternative sources like this, as well as media, government, and everything else, and then thinking it through yourself and making your own decisions.